Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was, I think, as I was telling you before, just your biography and what you've done in office and out of office, you really are the best of us in the U.S., so we're very grateful to have you with us for this week. I want to also introduce our other fantastic panelists. Immediately to her left, we have Bruce Wolpe, who was a former staffer, Democratic staffer under Henry Waxman in the U.S. Congress, but was also chief of staff to former Prime Minister Julia Gillard. And you can see him on basically every media channel you can imagine, explaining America to Australia. Then we have a non-resident fellow with us, Les Munson, who worked in the George W. Bush administration and also under Republican Senator Mark Kirk, but he was also Foreign Relations Committee staff director. And so we have a bipartisan, bicameral, and every other type of mix you can imagine panel to talk about what actually happens with Congress. And the reason that we want to do this, I should flag, is that you might have noticed in the US under the last few administrations in particular, that the president can say whatever they want, but Congress doesn't have to fund it. Congress is the one that really has the purse strings, very different than the parliamentary system. And so the president can talk about all sorts of priorities. They can talk about how they want to do this major initiative overseas, and that's a lot of hot air unless Congress signs off on it. And so what we want to do is, with this panel, is look beyond just what the executive branch does and actually focus on what is Congress doing. We've heard a lot today, and previously we hear a lot in the media about how bipartisan the consensus is in Congress on a number of things. But I want to delve a bit deeper into that. But before we get into the sort of substance, maybe we could just start with the first slide on the House of Representatives, because it's been a couple weeks since the US election, and we still don't know for sure the exact outcome of the House of Representatives races, but I think everyone has agreed, including the Associated Press, that the Republicans control it. Could I just go to you, Stephanie, on where you see this Congress outcome? Were you predicting a Republican takeover?
It's dangerous in Washington to make predictions about elections, is what I've discovered. But I didn't know who would hold the majority, but I knew it would be closely held. And I think, just to kind of give an update on this House of Representatives chart, there were five races remaining. They've called one of them, so in Republicans' favor. It looks like the other four, like much of the rest of the election, it's 2 to the D and 2 to the R. So at most, the Republicans will have the majority with about 2 to 3 votes. And if we go back in time a little bit, what that means. So the first time Trump came to office in 2017, he had about a 17 to 20 vote margin, just depending on the day, absences and vacancies and whatnot. In 2019, that reversed almost exactly to the Democrats being up between 17 and 20 votes. And then in 22, Democrats had a 5-vote margin. And in 23, Republicans had a 5-vote margin. That's a Congress that you just saw operate. The difference in, and I was a whip, which meant that I counted votes for Democratic leadership. The difference between when Democrats had the 5-vote margin and the Republicans had the 5-vote margin was that we were in the pandemic. And so Democrats allowed members to vote by proxy, which means that we could ensure that our full force of Democrats would show up. And Speaker Pelosi sort of governed with an iron fist. And so it was a little bit easier, I think, for us to get some bills across the finish line. In this last Congress, part of the challenge that you saw Speaker McCarthy and then Speaker Johnson have is that they went back to the old rules of Congress where you had to be present in order to vote. And so as you can imagine, a sick family member or an illness of a member or bad traffic in Washington, whatever it is, and you very shortly start to lose your majority. And I think the challenge for this coming Congress will be the sucking sound of the White House executive nominations that may kind of create a situation where that 2 to 3 vote majority gets really tight. The good news when you have such tight majorities is you have 2 ways to really get a piece of legislation across the finish line. One, you can go through a very painful process called reconciliation, which means that you do it just with one party, the controlling party's vote, and there are all kinds of rules around what can go into that package. Or the other way you can do it is to do it in a bipartisan way. And if you look at this last Congress, on the major issues, whether it was avoiding a debt ceiling issue or funding the government or funding Ukraine, providing support to Israel, all of those pieces of legislation passed with bipartisan support. So this tightly held Congress almost forces a center-out strategy on legislating.
And then, thank you for that on Congress. Maybe we could go to the Senate and get Les to talk on that, because that also went to the Republicans. I think most predicted that would go to the Republicans, but I think it's maybe different than what Donald Trump had in his first term of office.
Right, so Republicans have a 53 votes. That's pretty strong. I think most people expected them to be at 51 or 52. The immediate issue here is these recess appointments that have been floated by President Trump. And as we discussed in the first panel, some of these nominees have some interesting backgrounds and could have an interesting time while they're being considered in the Senate. And how will new Majority Leader John Thune handle this situation where the president has kind of immediately challenged it at least appears to be immediately challenging the Senate prerogative to pass muster on these important government positions. And so that is definitely something to track. But I think stepping back a little bit, it's important to remember a couple of things. Number one, the job of the majority leader, in addition to running the Senate floor and dealing with the White House and dealing with the Senate minority, is also to think about the next election cycle. So the smart folks in DC, I think, were immediately looking to those senators who are up in 2026. Who are the vulnerable Republicans? Who are the vulnerable Democrats? How will these issues play out for them? That is much more than anything else at the end of the day is going to be guiding what Senator Thune and Senator Schumer do on the floor with respect to these nominations. So how will those nominations actually be impacted when people go to vote in a couple of years is what the smart politicians are trying to anticipate. So that's like an immediate check on kind of this balance of power. The other quick thought I have here for folks is we've been talking a lot about what the executive branch wants to do in the Asia Pacific. Congress has a very strong view on that. It's bipartisan, as Stephanie's been pointing out. Congress is in fact tougher than the executive branch on the China relationship. It almost always is, no matter who is the president and no matter who is in charge of Congress. So the president has to negotiate not just in the region here, but also with a very tough legislative branch that's going to be skeptical of any deal that looks soft on China. And so this negotiation, if you will, over nominations and tariffs are all of a piece at the end of the day. And the president needs to advance on both fronts while not making sacrifices on the other. So I view all of this as interrelated, Jared.
Thank you. And I would highlight, we do have some of our publications of the U.S. Study Center outside, and some of my colleagues at the U.S. Study Center have actually looked at Congress on Asia, and you can see how the Biden administration would call for a certain amount on Indo-Pacific priorities, and Congress said, thanks, that's nice, we're going to actually give you way more than that. Yeah. So I think there is some, as you said, some Congress pushing back. But one thing I want to ask you, Bruce, when you worked in Congress as a Democratic staffer, you worked with Henry Waxman during the Obama administration, and you started some signature climate legislation, which I imagine was pretty influential in what ended up being the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed under the Biden, was basically done through the Biden administration. But my question to you is, what happens to the Inflation Reduction Act with a Republican control over the White House, Senate? and House of Representatives. From my own view, I saw that a lot of the initiatives were, Brian Deese, the sort of the guy, the architect of it, deliberately made the projects occur in Republican-leaning districts. So he'll say they tried to Trump-proof this as much as possible. Do you see it that way?
I think, first of all, I did predict that the Democrats would take control of the House of Representatives, so I was wrong on that. And I think the reason was that the enthusiasm of the vote for Harris was less than, frankly, she expected. And I think that was the difference, so that the majority was not returned to the Democrats. I think one thing that was great in the Inflation Reduction Act when projects were announced around the country was, even if you voted against it, when as soon as that ground was broken, you were there and saying, I'm bringing this dam and this road to my district, and I'm really happy about it. And so shamelessness actually goes hand in hand with progress. And that will continue. So in other words, where there are tangible benefits in a world which is not delivering them to a lot of people, they're going to be protected. But the bigger questions is, what is Trump's posture to Congress going to be? He has a Republican House, he has a Republican Senate. It's so much better than if he had had a Democratic House, because he would have been impeached a third time, and he would have just faced, his legislative program would have been derailed. So you have a rebuttable presumption that he can get stuff through if he holds together. One thing on the Democrats, though, they are extremely disciplined. They were highly disciplined over the past 2 years, very effective leadership. I think that is intact. I think it's important that not one Democratic leader was replaced because they did not take control of the House, whereas the chaos among Republicans as to who their leaders are going to be, there's every signal that that could continue just because there is a small but potent, highly charged pro-Trump, pro-MAGA faction among House Republicans who can stand up and say, we just have to do better. So I think a degree of instability on the Republican side in that very small majority, and an ability of Democrats to take immediate advantage of any tactical slip that they make. It's almost like you have a Westminster system on Capitol Hill, but the Constitution is not a Westminster Constitution. And that explains a lot of the corrosion of the effectiveness of democracy today in Washington.
And so do you see IRA going?
No. No.
I guess now that we have the opening thoughts from folks, I'd love to hear what you actually see this Congress doing. What we saw during the Trump administration, the first one, the only signature legislation they ended up passing was a tax cut. And we know that they will probably want to continue that because those tax cuts were set to expire in this next term of office. But what do you see them wanting to do? We saw what they weren't able to do during the first term. They weren't able to kill Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. They weren't able to do much on infrastructure, although we did have a lot of infrastructure weeks. What will they actually be doing? As much as people like to say that Trump breaks things, but he doesn't necessarily build things, but it seems like he has more support from a previously more, I guess, cantankerous Republican caucus. We can start with you, Stephanie.
Sure. I mean, I won't wager to see what they will achieve. I will tell you what they're going to try to do, and they've been pretty transparent about it. I think the number one priority is the extension of those Trump tax cuts to the tune of close to $5 trillion is what it's going to cost to extend those. In addition, they will want to try to make good on the tax promises that he made on the campaign trail, which will add a few $100 billion plus or minus, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. And they're doing this at a time where our deficit, our national debt is significantly high. The interest that we're paying on it exceeds the amount of money that we spend on our defense. So in order for them to extend these tax cuts and to make good on these campaign promises, they're going to need to either make the decision that they're going to pass this bill, likely to be done through that process I said called reconciliation, which requires the White House, the Senate, and the House Republicans to all line up and not lose really any votes in order for them to get through it. But they're going to have to decide whether they deficit spend to do this, or where are they going to get money to pay for it? And they have identified the Inflation Reduction Act, some of those tax credits that are in that, as one place to pay for it. However, it doesn't yield enough money really to even touch just the extension of the tax credit. The other place they would have to go to is the Affordable Care Act. And in past, they have been unable really to dismantle the Affordable Care Act, because it turns out people like having health care in America. And then the third place that is sort of being rumored is to have Congress actually legislate some of this tariffing. I think that would be really terrible, because it would take it out of the process that would enable exemptions. If it's legislated, it also puts it in a place where it makes it very difficult to undo. But that would, and the size of the legislated tariffs would have to be broad-scale tariffing in order to help pay for this bigger package. So that's what's in front of them. And they're hoping to get that done by April. But that's going to be a very, very tight rope for them to walk. Obviously, they also want to do border, and that costs money. In order to deport 1 million people, it cost about $88 billion. So and then there are some China priorities as well as energy priorities that are in the list of top 100-day activities. But again, they're going to have to thread a very tiny needle for the House, in the House of Representatives, as well as in the Senate. Even though they have a 53 votes. So
it's a lot of let's wait and see, as Heino said in the first panel, because we know tax cuts, but after that, it's part of anyone's game. Less than Bruce?
Yeah, I think probably expect things that you're not expecting to happen congressionally in the next 2 to 4 years. I think the big thing I'm going to be watching is what's the actual level of the U.S. Defense budget going forward. There's going to be a battle inside the Republican Party that will probably be won by the hawks, who want to see more spending over some of these budget cutter, more Freedom Caucus types. I suspect they're going to win, because it's going to be a bipartisan effort to increase defense spending. But that'll be something to watch, and probably an area where Congress is a little more functional than we've been hearing about so far today. The other thing, like to kind of Heino's point from the first panel, what happened during the first Trump administration? There actually were some constructive things. For example, Congress and the administration created the U.S. the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, which is actually a pretty smart response to the current challenge with respect to China. That actually happened during the Trump administration. There was nothing similar that happened during the Biden administration, which is what you would have expected. So,
could you maybe explain what that did?
So the DFC, which had been called OPIC previously, I think the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, President Trump and Congress agreed to a massive expansion of that agency, much higher budget, much broader authority to do kind of business partnerships in the developing world as a challenge to the Belt and Road Initiative from China. And it's had some successes. There are some places where it could have done a little bit better, but that was a significant legislative achievement. And so I would not rule out there being similar things that happen in the next 2 to 4 years. The other thing I'd advise people to kind of keep an eye on, President Trump starts off on January 20th as a lame duck. He cannot run for re-election. Congress knows this, and the natural flow of power in Washington is going to be from the executive branch into the legislative branch in a situation like that. President Trump is going to do some razzle-dazzle to try to distract people from that. One of the things he's doing is the DOGE, or the Department of Government Efficiency, with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. What it really is a presidential commission to recommend some budget cuts to Congress. Can he effectively do something that would actually pressure Congress to do some things he wants on the budget? I'm highly skeptical that it's going to work, but it's out there as a possibility. So the real structural battle to watch is, can a term-limited Trump really prevail with his desires in a Congress who is thinking about what's happening after his term? Remember, senators are there for 6 years. Trump is only going to be there for 4.
Bruce, top priorities for this Congress?
Well, I think a lot just depends on the mood, and I think we got to think about the sequence of what's going to unfold, because that's going to affect the mood. And the first thing up at these confirmations is not just Matt Gaetz, it's also the Director of National Intelligence, the Secretary of Health and Education, the Defense Secretary. And they're all in trouble, and that means chaos at the beginning of these confirmation hearings will be early. Bill Clinton stumbled early in his term. 2 years later, the House, he had a terrible midterm election. Then you got to think, what's he going to do next? Well, he has his tariffs. The tariff wars may well start, and he has power on immigration, so the deportations may start. So in other words, you may have a country in, at the least, a state of high anxiety and tension throughout all aspects of society, and he wants a tax cut for, that essentially is skewed towards the wealthiest in America, and he has this Elon Musk perching on his shoulder like the American eagle, looking at what he can do across the nation. It's actually, Elon Musk is actually a supercharged think tank for the Trump administration, and he'll come up exactly with a list. He'll turn it over to the president and say, this should be cut, this should be cut. Trump will say, great. He presents that to Congress, and so the anxiety still rises. And I don't see any relief for it. The thing that brings relief to it is success. And for the moment, it's going to be just very, very choppy. I think it means for the Democrats, they will stay as disciplined as possible. And the Republicans, I think the locus is going to be the Republicans in the Senate. And how do they react sensibly to what's going on? Because that could provide a little stabilizing bar for what we're facing.
You mentioned, Les, the Doge, and I have to wonder, I think I have an idea of why you have skepticism, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on why you have some skepticism about what they're going to be able to do.
Well, if you want an idea to die in Washington, create a commission to take a look at it. They will write a report. It will get put on a shelf.
We must do something about Social Security.
Yeah, that was actually an example of one that kind of worked way back in the day. I think my suspicion is what the president-elect was doing here was taking a couple of very big personalities that had helped him in the election, given them what appears to be a significant role. The report isn't due for like a year and a half. People are going to forget. The relationships could change over time. All of these folks are a bit mercurial at best. And so I have a feeling that when they actually come up with these recommendations, it's going to be a very different situation than we have right now. Again, at the end of the day, Congress is thinking about itself and its reelection. The House is up every 2 years. A third of the Senate is up. The balance of power is always in the offing for the Senate in an election, even though it's only a third of the members. That's what they're thinking about. So when they get that report in June of 2026, they're going to be thinking, how is this going to impact, Susan Collins' reelection in Maine, frankly? Is it going to help her or hurt her? And that's how they're going to behave.
And I'll just note that Congress, at the end of the day, has the power of the purse. And in an election year, in order for them to achieve the cuts that they have promised, they are going to have to cut Social Security, Medicare, like entitlements. Yeah. And I don't know of a brave politician who in an election year is going to stand up in front of an elderly crowd and say, I'm sorry, but things are really expensive because of the tariffing policy, but now we're also going to cut your benefits. That just doesn't exist.
Can I come back just on one point you made on Trump's relative power, a lame duck? I don't see it the same way. Trump does not have to face the voters again. That actually frees him even more. And he likes the exercise of power. He wants to get his agenda done, and he's impatient about it. And time is limited. And so if he's not facing the voters again, he doesn't have the consequences of facing the voters again. So I think actually he is in a stronger position to do what he wants to do, and I think he will really work at it very, very hard.
I'll add one thing. And Bruce, you and I agree on a lot of stuff. This is one where I don't think we're going to agree.
Okay, good.
One other thing about President Trump from the first term is he actually communicates with members of Congress regularly. This is not something that, for example, President Obama really did very well. President Trump was on the phone with members of Congress all the time. He was bugging them. He was calling their cell phones. They could call him. He was engaged in the process. Obviously, there's going to be mixed results from that, but he's going to be taking the temperature of Congress all the way through this. And if for Bruce to be correct, for him to actually be able to enact his agenda, he's going to have to be in the moment with those members and understand the pressures on them for their reelection and how, for example, how the Republicans will try to keep the majority in 2026 and that kind of thing. So if he plays into that, those are immediate constraints on his behavior, but it will lead to an agenda that might come out of this system. That's the process that's really going to happen.
But he's also going to use executive power to the max. He believes in it, and if he can do it, and he believes that his courts will sustain.
As does every president.
One thing that President Trump did threaten to do in the first term is quite explicit, was putting pressure on some allies, and saying, making threats. Do more, otherwise we're out. You're not paying us enough. But then Congress actually stepped in and inserted some language to legislation that would have stopped that. Could you maybe speak on that, Stephanie?
So the National Defense Authorization Act, on the Senate side, I think they put some language in that said that he couldn't withdraw from NATO or use any of the appropriated dollars to withdraw from NATO. The problem, though, is that the way they wrote it and what ended up in the end in the bill dropped out the enforcement element of it. So the question becomes, who litigates it? Like, should he decide to violate the law as it was passed in this National Defense Authorization Act, who's going to sue him? And what's the path for litigation and enforcement? And so, yes, I think Congress did try to put some guardrails up, knowing that this might be coming. But as with many things that will happen over the this next term, the question will be, who files the lawsuit when it comes to deporting U.S. born children of illegal immigrants, or any of the other things that may happen. The big question is, do we have a legal system that enables enforcement of the prohibition from withdrawing from NATO or any of the immigration things that he hopes to implement?
I guess then moving on to other things that we saw in the Trump administration, and we've seen it in basically every U.S. administration in my lifetime, and that is very fierce government fights or congressional fights over government funding. We saw a 35-day shutdown during the first term of office. I have a feeling that had something to do with the more small government-minded chief of staff that President Trump had at the time. But I'd love to hear maybe Bruce and Les about whether you think government shutdowns are something that or fierce fights on the budget, more CRs, is that something that we're going to see? We just had 4 years of a Biden administration in which he came to the White House with half a century of DC experience and senatorial congressional experience. So maybe he was used to legislating and giving the other side the credit so that they could just keep government open. Are things going to change with President Trump back? Are we going to see more government shutdowns?
There could be. I hope not. There's no payoff for shutting down the government. I mean, Biden, there was no default of the United States, that we came right to the razor's edge of that, and there was no shutdown of the government. The person who is seen as fomenting a shutdown of the government suffers politically. His or her party suffers politically. It's madness. But nevertheless, there is just this angst in some circles in Washington that we just have to go after the deep state and take it down to get to a better place. So I don't think it will happen, but things can get out of control.
Yeah, could President Trump and the congressional leadership of Mike Johnson and John Thune be outflanked to the right by the Freedom Caucus and they take down the government for a few days? I suppose it's theoretically possible. Seems unlikely to me. Speaker Johnson, who's been speaker almost for a whole year now, good for him, has shown, frankly, some leadership and a real ability to kind of grow into office. He's gone through the Rubicon of having to pass a budget with Democratic votes.
Right.
Which is the thing that took down previous Republican speakers. He has survived that process. He is in good stead with the president-elect. I think he's going to be in a position to successfully manage this challenge. It's going to be dicey, of course, because the House it's so split. And You know, folks, the other thing to remember is American politics are split right down the middle. As much as it looks like President Trump won convincingly a couple of weeks ago, and he did, he still got less than 50% of the vote, of the actual popular vote. He won the popular vote, but he got less than 50% of it. The House is almost divided 50-50. The Senate's 53-47. That is actually more of a landslide than anything else in the US government. So just remember, like, all of this stuff is gonna be dicey. There's gonna be drama no matter what because the numbers are so close.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll let you in on a secret for what ends shutdowns, having sat through Washington for a number of them under the Trump administration. Usually they back the deadline up to something that matters to members, like Thanksgiving or Christmas.
You can't go home, it's Christmas Eve.
You can't, right. And so I have sat in Washington as the holidays approach, my kids knew Santa was coming, but not quite sure if mom was gonna be home, okay? So usually some sort of deadline like that, or if it goes to a shutdown, there are a lot of members who sleep in their offices. I know that sounds really weird. And so, but they do, and then they use the House gym to shower up. And the thing that ended the first Trump shutdown was that members could no longer use the House gym to take their showers because the government's in shutdown. There's nobody refreshing towels. So it creates an uncomfortable, when you make members of Congress uncomfortable, they find a way to do their jobs a little bit more quickly. And so should we go into a shutdown, it will last for some amount of time, and then they will come to their senses and come to an agreement and fund the government and move on. And then they back pay all the people who, usually they put in a provision to back pay all the people who weren't getting paid during that time.
Obamacare passed the Senate on Christmas Eve, and it was the biggest Charles Dickens moment I've ever experienced in my life.
Thank you. Just conscious of time so that we can try to stay on schedule for the rest of the day. Maybe we could go down, starting with Les and move our way down, on what you think will be the most consequential things that Australia should be paying attention to in Congress to understand, you know, what is moving forward for the next 2 years, in particular for this congressional session. What should Australia be paying attention to in all the dynamics in Congress? There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of theater, as you were saying, but what's actually the most substantive thing to be watching in Congress for the next 2 years?
In my view, I mentioned it before, I think it's the defense budget. How robust is it going to be? The bigger the US defense budget, the more it enables our policymakers to be flexible in the region. It gives them more tools to work with. Kind of secondarily, I'd look at that budget for State Department and foreign assistance, the so-called international affairs budget. That's going to be targeted by a lot of Trump folks. Can Congress keep that alive while they're taking a hard look at the U.S. defense budget? But I think things like AUKUS and some of these other initiatives, in the long run, the success of those is tied to robust U.S. defense spending. At the end of the day, that's the thing that matters most.
Australia goes into this period in the most favored position. I agree with everything that Kurt said. As far as its standing is concerned, it is just rock solid, bipartisan. The work has been done. It started over a year ago with DFAT, throughout the other agencies, the intelligence agencies, the defense ties and so forth, to wargame and anticipate what could happen. Who do we need to make outreach to? How do we build these bridges? And those bridges have been built, and they are solid. So I think Australia can go in with a higher degree of confidence than anybody else. It had the most untroubled relationship with the first Trump presidency than any other country on the planet, and that includes Israel, includes the UK, and so forth. So that is that base has been hardened, and so it's going to be fine. So I think just keep that in the back of the mind to leverage the crisis points that may emerge. But it's going to be trade in China. That is the number one thing. What the hell is he going to do on China, and how is that going to affect this country? And that is the big issue.
I think this Congress, unlike the Congress that the first Trump administration came into, is more solidly in his control. Not only are the members that have been elected in the time since more of the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, but there's not the kind of dissension that existed in his first term where it wasn't clear that he had full control over the Republican Party. He does today in a way that you see there's both political and physical fear from Republicans of opposing anything that Trump would like to see happen. And so his priorities, as have been mentioned previously, is when it comes to foreign countries, what is your trade deficit or your trade balance with the United States, and are you ponying up for the military and security purposes? So I think those, and because he really does have a better control over the Congress, you will see those priorities reflected in the Republican-controlled Congress this cycle in a way that maybe didn't exist in the first term.
There is no basis for Australia to be hit by tariffs. We have a free trade agreement and we have a trade deficit with the United States. And as the Prime Minister said, that's been in effect for 75 years since Harry Truman. And so there is no reason for Australia to be a target of these tariffs, and that should be driven home.
Excellent. Thank you so much for a fantastic panel. Please join me in thanking this.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.